A young Muslim outsmarts an arrogant atheist professor with a simple glass of water. In a crowded lecture hall buzzing with intellectual energy, a young Muslim man quietly stunned an entire audience, silencing an infamously arrogant atheist professor using nothing more than calm reasoning and a glass of water. It began as expected. Professor Joshua Watkins, known for his biting intellect and reputation for demolishing religious arguments, stood proudly at the center of the stage. A smirk played across his face as he scanned the audience, his voice thundering through the room. "Is there a Muslim here?" he challenged, "brave enough to prove the existence of God? Step forward, and I guarantee you'll leave without your faith tonight." The hall fell silent. Murmurs spread. Some bowed their heads, others chuckled nervously. Watkins' loyal followers, atheist academics and students, looked around smugly, convinced no one would dare respond. After all, the professor had humiliated many before. But then, from the crowd, a hand rose. A young man, just 24 years old, stood with composed confidence. His name was Abdul Rahman. He had no credentials, no formal debating background, just clarity in his eyes and faith in his heart. Laughter erupted across the room. Some scoffed, a few shook their heads in disbelief. Watkins, amused, narrowed his eyes. "A young Muslim," he mocked, "with no degree, no scientific or philosophical training, wants to debate me? You don't need to be a professor to recognize the truth," Abdul Rahman replied with calm resolve. The auditorium quieted once more. Watkins, intrigued by the unexpected poise, gestured grandly. "Very well," he said. "Let's see what you've got." As Abdul Rahman walked to the stage and sat across from the professor, the lights narrowed on the two. The debate wasn't just about ideas now. It was a confrontation between ego and faith, between arrogance and truth. Watkins leaned forward. "Let's begin with something simple," he said condescendingly. "If your God exists, show him to me. Where is he?" Laughter trickled through the audience. It was a familiar tactic, one Watkins had used to trap many opponents. After all, no one could show God. Without hesitation, Abdul Rahman lifted a glass of water from the table and held it up. "Professor," he began, "do you believe in the existence of human reason?" Watkins blinked. "Of course." "Can you show it to me?" the young man asked. "Not its outcomes, reason itself, its shape, color, or form." Watkins leaned back, the trap now turning on him. "That's impossible," he admitted. "Exactly," Abdul Rahman nodded. "We cannot see reason, yet we know it exists, because we witness its effects. In thought, in decision, in invention. The same is true for God. We may not see him directly, but we see his signs. Everywhere, in the order of the cosmos, in the laws of nature, in life emerging from lifelessness." A stir swept through the audience. Faces once filled with amusement were now sober, thoughtful. Trying to recover, Watkins countered, "But reason comes from within the human mind. It's a product of ourselves. How can you prove that your God exists? How do you know your God is the true one?" Abdul Rahman remained composed. "Professor, do you believe that everything in existence has a cause?" "Yes, of course. If you came across a beautifully designed house, would you assume it built itself?" "Of course not," Watkins replied, scoffing. "Then what of the universe?" Abdul Rahman asked. "Far more complex than any house, vast beyond imagination. Can something that intricate, that ordered, come into being without a creator?" The professor fell silent. The room was now completely still. Watkins fumbled for a response. "I accept that there are natural laws that govern the universe," he offered weakly, "but that doesn't prove a God. It just means the universe is structured." "Then who created that structure?" Abdul Rahman asked gently. Watkins opened his mouth, then paused. He had no answer. "Professor," the young man continued, voice steady, The Quran addressed this very question over 1,400 years ago. In Surah At-Tur, verse 35, it asks, "Were they created by nothing, or were they the creators of themselves?" He let the words hang in the air. The weight of the verse, paired with the logic of his argument, rippled through the room. Even the most loyal followers of Watkins shifted uncomfortably. Some were visibly stunned. A few even slumped in their chairs in silent frustration. The professor had no retort. The mighty atheist, usually so quick to dismantle faith, had been rendered speechless by a young man with nothing but conviction, calmness, and a glass of water. A verse that silenced the room. The power of reason and faith. To settle the matter once and for all, Abdul Rahman invoked a Quranic verse that directly confronted the foundation of human reasoning. "It is impossible," he said firmly, "for something to come into being without a cause, and equally impossible for something to create itself. Therefore, there must be a creator." A ripple spread through the audience. The smug expressions that once dominated the room gave way to quiet contemplation. The laughter and whispering had ceased. People were now truly listening, processing, perhaps for the first time, logic that couldn't be waved away. Professor Watkins exhaled slowly. A tight, uneasy smile formed on his lips. "You're clever," he conceded, his voice clipped. "But this debate isn't over. I still have questions that challenge your religion." Abdul Rahman offered a calm nod, his voice unshaken. "Please, Professor, I'm ready." The energy in the room shifted once more. What had started as a lopsided spectacle, an intellectual giant set to crush a young believer, had turned into a true clash of minds. And Abdul Rahman wasn't just holding his ground, he was winning ground with every answer. His logic wasn't rooted in emotion or blind faith, but in calm, structured reasoning that pierced deeply. Watkins straightened in his chair, his pride now on the line. A symbolic figure within the atheist intellectual community, a defeat here would sting. Not just his ego, but his reputation. He leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "All right," he said. "Maybe I can't fully refute your argument for God's existence, but let's talk about Islam itself. It's filled with strange, restrictive rules. Why would a merciful God ban things like pork or alcohol? If he created everything, why deny people the enjoyment of those things?" The audience stirred again. This was familiar territory for Watkins, the criticism of religious practices. But Abdul Rahman's expression didn't falter. He simply asked, "Professor, if someone gave you a luxury car, an expensive, high-performance vehicle, would you treat it carelessly?" "Of course not," Watkins replied without hesitation. "And if the manual clearly stated that the engine required a specific type of oil to function properly, would you ignore that instruction?" "No," Watkins said, frowning slightly now. "Then why?" Abdul Rahman asked gently. "Do you question it when the creator of the human being provides instructions for how to care for the body and soul? Doesn't the designer know what's best for his creation, just like the engineer understands the limits of his machine?" Silence swept the room. Watkins shifted uncomfortably. Even some of his supporters looked uncertain now. Abdul Rahman continued, "The prohibition of pork and alcohol isn't about denying pleasure. It's about protecting us. Scientific studies have shown that pork often carries parasites and harmful bacteria. Alcohol damages the liver, impairs judgment, destroys families, and leads to countless deaths. Islam forbids these not as punishments, but as protections, for our health, our dignity, and the well-being of society." Watkins inhaled sharply, caught off guard by the scientific grounding in the response. "All right," he pushed, "then what about prayer? 5 times a day? Or fasting for an entire month? Isn't that excessive? Why would God make life harder for his followers?" Abdul Rahman smiled, unshaken. "Professor, If someone wants a healthy, strong body, would exercising once a month be enough? Of course not, Watkins replied automatically. Exactly, Abdul Rahman said. Prayer 5 times a day is spiritual exercise. It's maintenance of the soul. Just as physical training strengthens the body, regular prayer purifies the heart, calms the mind, and reinforces self-discipline. It connects us with the Creator. Even scientific studies now confirm that prayer movements improve circulation and reduce stress. Heads nodded throughout the hall. People weren't just hearing. They were reflecting. Watkins, sensing his influence slipping, latched onto another argument. And fasting? He said, his tone rising. Why would a loving God require people to starve themselves for an entire month? Isn't that cruel? Abdul Rahman took a deep breath. His reply came with quiet strength. Professor, when people want to rid their bodies of toxins, they go through detox. It's uncomfortable, sometimes even painful, but necessary for healing. Watkins nodded slowly, almost unconsciously. Fasting, Abdul Rahman said, is both a physical and spiritual detox. Modern science confirms that fasting boosts immunity, repairs cells, and improves overall health. But beyond the body, it trains the soul. It teaches self-control. It fosters empathy, so we understand the pain of the hungry, not as a theory, but as an experience. The murmurs returned, this time louder, deeper. The crowd was no longer cheering for Watkins. They were absorbing Abdul Rahman's words with newfound respect. God doesn't place burdens upon us to make life harder, Abdul Rahman said, his gaze unwavering. He gives us guidance because he knows what's best for us. As it's written in the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 286, Allah does not burden a soul beyond that it can bear. Every command is a path to goodness, not a punishment. Watkins was silent. His eyes dropped for a moment, and when he looked up, the confidence in them had faded. For the first time in years of debating, he had met someone who not only countered his arguments but did so with logic that resonated far beyond the stage. Still, his pride wouldn't let him yield. Not just yet. Fine, he said at last, his voice quieter, strained. You've answered well, but there's one last question I must ask. The hall froze. The tension was palpable. Every eye turned toward Abdul Rahman. Watkins' final question was one that had shaken countless believers before. If God is truly all-powerful and all-good, he said, voice low and intense, then why does he allow suffering in the world? Not a sound could be heard. The room, once filled with noise and laughter, was now a vacuum of silence. The weight of that question hung heavy in the air, but Abdul Rahman only smiled, as though the question were familiar. Professor, he asked gently, have you ever been to a gym? Watkins blinked. What does that have to do with anything? In the gym, Abdul Rahman said, people lift weights. Their muscles ache. They sweat. They endure pain. Why? Because they understand that struggle brings strength. Pain has a purpose. Watkins stared, his expression frozen, the impact settling in. The atmosphere began to shift palpably as Watkins, visibly affected, followed the train of reasoning. Life is the same, Abdul Rahman continued, his voice steady and firm. Hardship and suffering. These are not signs that God has turned away. They are part of the process, part of growth. Without pain, we do not develop. Without trials, we never mature. God doesn't give us challenges to break us, but to lift us higher. Once again, silence enveloped the room. But this time, it wasn't awkward or mocking. It was the silence of thought, of hearts absorbing the weight of truth. And God has promised us, Abdul Rahman went on, his voice calm and clear, in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 286, Allah does not burden a soul beyond what it can bear. Every hardship has a reason. Every pain carries a purpose. That's not cruelty, it's love." Watkins stared at him, stunned. For the first time in his long career of debates and public lectures, he felt something unfamiliar creeping in. Defeat. He opened his mouth to counter, but no words came. His mind, once quick to slice arguments to pieces, found no handle to grip. Around him, the once jeering audience sat silent. Some faces looked visibly moved. Then it struck him like a thunderclap. This entire time it wasn't Abdul Rahman being tested. It was him. Watkins gripped the sides of his chair, his posture rigid. His thoughts were a storm. How had this young, relatively unknown Muslim managed to not only defend his faith but do so with logic, grace, and responses that didn't just satisfy? They transformed. "I'm not done yet," Watkins said suddenly, his voice softer now, almost vulnerable. "I have one last question." Abdul Rahman gave a composed nod. "Go ahead, Professor." Watkins pointed to the same glass of water that had sparked the debate. "Let's go back to this," he said. "If I pour poison into this glass, the person who drinks it will die. If I pour in honey, it will nourish to." The weight in the room returned. All eyes turned to Abdul Rahman. This was the question Watkins had been holding in reserve. His final move, the one he believed would tilt the debate in his favor. But Abdul Rahman remained calm. He reached out and gently picked up the glass, holding it before the audience, examining it for a moment before he spoke. "Professor," he said softly, "who is responsible for what goes into this glass?" Watkins blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Abdul Rahman clarified, "if someone pours poison into this glass, is the glass at fault, or the one who poured it?" Watkins went still. The trap had closed, and he saw it. "This world," Abdul Rahman continued, "was created pure, balanced. Like this glass, it was given to us in perfection. But God also gave us something else, free will, the ability to choose what we pour into our lives, honey or poison." Watkins opened his mouth to speak, but Abdul Rahman wasn't finished. "God did not create mindless robots programmed to do only good. He gave us the freedom to choose, and with that freedom comes the possibility of evil. That, Professor, is the test of life. If He intervened and stopped every harmful act before it happened, then we would no longer be free, and without freedom, goodness means nothing." The silence grew deeper, now thick with realization. Even the staunchest skeptics in the crowd looked shaken. "Imagine," Abdul Rahman said gently, "if every time someone tried to steal, their hand became paralyzed. Or every time they tried to lie, their mouth froze shut. That wouldn't be morality. It would be programming. Goodness wouldn't be chosen. It would be enforced. And forced virtue is no virtue at all." Watkins swallowed, his throat dry. The analogy had pierced through more than his argument. It touched something far deeper. "Picture a student sitting for an exam," Abdul Rahman went on. "If the teacher stood over him and whispered all the answers, did the student actually learn anything? Did he grow? Number. He may pass the test, but it would be empty, devoid of effort, of struggle, of meaning." Watkins remained frozen, stunned. Every word Abdul Rahman spoke carved through the fog in his mind with surgical clarity. "God has given us reason, a heart, and guidance," Abdul Rahman said. "He hasn't left us alone. As it says in Surah Al-Insan, verse 3, indeed, we guided him to the path, whether he is grateful or ungrateful." Then, looking directly into Watkins' eyes, he concluded, "God gave us this glass of life, but what we pour into it, honey or poison, is up to us, and one day we'll all be held accountable for what we chose to fill it with." Watkins sat motionless. His lips didn't move. His eyes locked on the glass as though he were seeing it for the first time. His hands trembled slightly and his eyes glistened, not with pride or defiance but with something far rarer in a man like him, humility. The hall was hushed. Not a whisper, not a laugh. Even Watkins' most loyal followers sat silently, visibly affected, some wide-eyed, others quietly wiping away tears. And then, something no one had expected happened. Joshua Watkins bowed his head. His shoulders trembled. A single tear fell, then another. The sound of a soft gasp echoed from the audience. With a voice cracked and thick with emotion, he looked up at Abdul Rahman. Gone was the arrogance. Gone was the cold certainty. In its place, confusion, vulnerability, and awe. "I've spent my entire life," he whispered, "attacking something I never truly understood." His hand, shaking, reached for the Quran that had been resting on the table throughout the debate. He lifted it carefully, reverently, as though it were something sacred, and then did something that left every person in the room breathless. He pressed it to his chest and wept. Around him, his once boisterous supporters sat in stunned silence. Some leaned forward in disbelief, others wiped their faces, overwhelmed by what had just unfolded. A profound shift had occurred in that hall, one not of intellect alone, but of hearts. That night, a young Muslim man named Abdul Rahman had stepped into the room as an underdog. But he walked out as the man who made one of the proudest, most outspoken atheists bow to truth, not through anger or ridicule, but through wisdom, patience, and sincerity. The evening that began with laughter and mockery had ended in tears and reflection. In the very heart of that hall, in front of hundreds of witnesses, a longtime opponent of faith had found something he never expected: peace. And it had all started with a simple glass of water. Time seemed to pause, not a single laugh, not a single cough, only the sound of breath being held and hearts perhaps being changed forever. Joshua Watkins, once feared and revered for his razor-sharp intellect and unrelenting tongue, now sat on the stage, weeping openly. The Quran was clutched tightly to his chest, his fingers curled around it with trembling reverence. His eyes were swollen, his cheeks wet with tears, and his lips moved silently, whispering words only he could hear. Around him, the audience sat in stunned disbelief. The followers who had once cheered his every word, certain of his intellectual triumph, were now speechless. The man they had admired and idolized for years, their symbol of reason and defiance, had not only lost the debate, but had surrendered in the most unexpected way. And yet he was not defeated by humiliation or force, but by the steady, unshakable logic and serene conviction of a 24-year-old Muslim named Abdul Rahman. But Abdul Rahman didn't gloat. He didn't smirk or revel in victory. He sat calmly, his gaze fixed on Watkins, not as an adversary, but as a fellow soul who had finally come home. There was no trace of superiority in his expression, only compassion and understanding. Watkins slowly lifted his head. His face still glistened with tears, but the arrogance, the cold certainty that once defined him, had melted away. What remained was something far deeper: submission. He stared at Abdul Rahman as though he were trying to comprehend the seismic shift that had just taken place within him. His voice cracked as he spoke, barely audible. "I've spent my life," he whispered, "attacking something that turned out to be true." A collective gasp rippled through the room as the audience held its breath. In the front row, a man who had earlier sneered at Abdul Rahman now looked away in shame. A woman nearby quietly wiped tears from her cheeks, her earlier skepticism dissolved by what she had witnessed. "I read the Quran," Watkins continued, his voice raw and trembling. "I studied it. I analyzed it. I dissected it. I looked for inconsistencies, for flaws, but I never truly understood it, not until tonight." His gaze shifted to the glass of water still sitting on the table, now no longer just a symbol, but a vessel that had carried a life-altering truth. "I always demanded evidence," he said, voice shaking. "I wanted proof, something tangible, measurable, But I forgot. Some of the most real things in life are invisible. Abdul Rahman offered a soft, knowing smile. Like thought, Watkins said, meeting his gaze. Like love. Like truth. He paused, then added gently, and like God. Suddenly, a voice rang out from the audience, a man shouting, his tone harsh and disbelieving. "This has to be a joke. You can't be serious." Watkins turned to him, eyes still shimmering with tears. His voice, though quiet, carried the weight of truth. "I've never been more serious in my life," he said. "I was wrong. All these years. I rejected God not because I understood him, but because I never even tried." A hushed murmur began to spread through the hall. But these were not the scoffs and laughter that had filled the air earlier. They were the murmurs of minds beginning to turn inward, of doubt, of contemplation, of hearts awakening. Watkins' own followers, once so proud, now sat visibly unsettled. They were not witnessing their leader's collapse. They were witnessing his awakening. "Professor," Abdul Rahman said softly, his voice filled with calm assurance, "life is a journey. No one is ever too far to turn back. If your heart has found the truth, the next step is to accept it sincerely." Watkins looked up at him, eyes clearer now than ever before, as if a new light had taken root within him. "I want to read the Quran again," he said, barely above a whisper, "but this time, not to critique it, to understand it." In the back row, an elderly man wiped tears from his lined cheeks. Others who had once laughed at Islam now sat with lowered heads, their faces marked by reflection. Some pressed, their lips together to keep from crying. The hall, once a battlefield of ideologies, had transformed into a sanctuary of silence and contemplation. Then a timid voice from the front row broke the stillness. A woman raised her hand slightly and asked, her voice trembling, "Is it possible for me to have a copy of the Quran too?" Abdul Rahman smiled warmly. "The Quran," he said gently, "is not just for Muslims. It is a guide for anyone seeking the truth." And in that moment, the same hall that once echoed with mockery now radiated with sincerity and hope. That night, many hearts were stirred. Many minds began to question the certainty of their disbelief. As Watkins, eyes still red, extended his hand toward Abdul Rahman, this time not to challenge him, but to thank him, a silent understanding passed between them. What the audience witnessed that night was not merely a debate. It was a transformation. A man, known around the world for tearing down religious faith, had laid down his pride, and in its place embraced something far greater than himself. And it had all started with a single glass of water. The air in the room had changed. No trace remained of the earlier arrogance. Those who had gathered in anticipation of Abdul Rahman's defeat now sat in awe, watching the very man they'd come to support hold the Quran like it was the most precious thing he had ever touched. Watkins wiped his tear-streaked face and turned to Abdul Rahman, eyes glistening with a strange mix of sorrow, humility, and peace. "I spent my life searching for truth in all the wrong places," he admitted. "I didn't reject God because he wasn't real. I rejected him because I never took the time to truly understand him." In the front rows, people began to weep openly. They had expected to witness the humiliation of a young Muslim at the hands of one of atheism's most brilliant minds. Instead, they saw that very man humbled, bowed not by defeat, but by revelation. Watkins glanced once more at the glass of water. This time he smiled, not with smugness, but with reverence. "I used to think I understood everything," he said softly. "But tonight, with just a glass of water, I learned that there's something far greater than reason alone." He turned to the audience. "If anyone here is still searching, read the Quran, but read it with an open heart. I know I will." Abdul Rahman didn't respond. He didn't need to. That night, his unwavering logic, quiet demeanor, and sincere faith had spoken more powerfully than any argument ever could. Though only one man had openly embraced the truth, many hearts had begun to shift, to crack beneath the weight of what they had just witnessed. The light had entered, and once it does, no darkness can drive it out. This story serves as a reminder that truth doesn't shout. It reveals itself through clarity, sincerity, and patience. Abdul Rahman didn't rely on anger or emotion. He relied on reason, composure, and a heart anchored in faith. It reminds us, too, that often the greatest barrier to truth is not ignorance, but pride. Joshua Watkins had been brilliant, but for years his own ego blinded him to the truth, until, one evening, a young man reminded him, and all who watched, that truth is greater than intellect, and that faith is not weakness, but wisdom. Finally, this story teaches us something simple yet profound. Even the most ordinary things, a glass of water, can carry the deepest truths. Because truth doesn't always require thunder. Sometimes it only needs a still heart, a quiet mind, and the courage to listen.